So we come on a curb, and I had to look at the street because I was in Germany on the street. And there's then from here to the boat there, 15 Russian soldiers.
Wow.
They took that village. And we didn't know that. In the morning, we slept there, you know.
Berlin, 1941. The city, once known for its grand avenues and vibrant culture, had become a place shrouded in suspicion and fear. The war had transformed every corner, every block, and every building into a potential trap. People whispered behind closed doors, and neighbors watched each other with wary eyes. The once lively cafes were now filled with soldiers in gray uniforms, and the streets were patrolled by the iron hand of the Gestapo. Amidst the constant threat of discovery, one woman dared to act differently. Johanna Eck, a widow in her mid-60s, living alone in a modest apartment in Tempelhof, Berlin, quietly became a beacon of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. Johanna Eck was not a woman of wealth or influence. She was a retired seamstress and a devout Catholic whose life had been marked by hardship and loss. Her husband had passed away years before, and her children were no longer alive. She lived alone, a small figure moving quietly through her daily routine, invisible to most. But what made Johanna unique was her unwavering belief that every human life had value, a belief that she would put into action at a time when such convictions were considered a crime. The danger was all around her, the Nazi regime was in full swing, and the Jewish community, once a thriving part of Berlin's fabric, was now being systematically torn apart. Jews were being rounded up, their homes raided, and their businesses shut down. Star of David patches adorned their clothes, marking them as outcasts, and deportation orders loomed over every family. It was in these terrifying circumstances that Johanna, an unassuming elderly woman, took her first step into the dangerous world of resistance. One cold November evening, a knock at Johanna's door changed everything. Standing outside was a young Jewish woman named Ruth Oppenheim, trembling and desperate. Ruth had been hiding from the authorities for weeks. Her family had been taken, and she was alone, hungry and terrified. Somehow she had found her way to Johanna's modest apartment, clutching nothing but a small bag and a fading hope that someone might help her. Johanna opened the door without hesitation, her gaze steady and calm as she took in the sight of the frightened girl before her. "Come in, child," Johanna said softly, stepping aside to let Ruth enter. The words were simple, but in that moment, they were nothing short of a lifeline. Ruth hesitated, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. What if this was a trap? What if this woman, a stranger, turned her over to the Gestapo? But Ruth had no other options. Slowly, she stepped inside, crossing the threshold of what would become her sanctuary. For Ruth, the days that followed were filled with anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren sent her heart racing. She stayed in Johanna's small, cluttered back room, a space barely big enough for a single bed and a chair. Johanna provided her with food and clothing, speaking gently to her each morning and evening, offering small comforts in the midst of the chaos. Ruth had not known kindness like this in a long time. Johanna did not ask for details of Ruth's past, nor did she probe into her fears. Instead, she simply offered her presence, her steady, quiet support. But harboring a Jewish person in 1941 Berlin was a death sentence, not only for Ruth, but also for Johanna. The Nazi regime had made it clear, aiding Jews was treason. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and the Gestapo's reach extended into every part of daily life. Yet Johanna did not waver. Her apartment, though small and unremarkable, became a sanctuary, a hidden world where Ruth could breathe without fear. As the weeks turned into months, Ruth was not the only one to find safety there. Word spread quietly among those living in the shadows, passed from one desperate soul to another. "Go to Johanna Eck," they whispered. "She will help you." And so they came, each with their own story of loss and fear. There was Max, a young Jewish man who had managed to escape from a deportation train bound for Auschwitz. With nowhere to go and no one to trust, he wandered the streets, cold and starving, until a sympathetic stranger directed him to Johanna's door. Then there was Sarah, a mother of 2 young children, whose husband had been taken in a raid. She appeared at Johanna's doorstep one rainy night, clutching her children close, their faces pale and thin with hunger. For each one, Johanna had a place. Her tiny apartment seemed to expand and contract like a living thing, accommodating more people than it seemed possible to hold. During the day, they hid in silence, hardly daring to move. At night, when the streets were quiet and the city slept under the blanket of darkness, Johanna would slip out to gather food and news. She had no contacts in the resistance, no secret network of allies. She was alone in this, navigating a treacherous path with only her courage and her faith to guide her. One evening, as Johanna returned from a late-night errand, she noticed two men lingering outside her building. Her heart tightened. Were they Gestapo? Had someone betrayed her? She forced herself to keep walking, her steps steady and unhurried, though every instinct screamed at her to run. She climbed the stairs slowly, counting each step, and slipped inside her apartment without a sound. Inside, Ruth and the others were waiting, their eyes wide with fear. Johanna didn't speak. She gestured for silence and moved quickly to the window, peering through the thin curtains. The men were still there, talking in low voices. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to think. They couldn't stay here. Not tonight. She turned to her small band of hidden guests, her face pale but calm. "We have to leave," she whispered. There was no argument, no hesitation. They gathered what little they had and followed her, slipping out the back entrance and into the dark alleyways of Berlin. That night, Johanna led them through the labyrinthine streets of the city, avoiding patrols and checkpoints with a skill that belied her age. She guided them to an old friend's house on the outskirts of town, a sympathetic woman who took them in without question. Only when they were safely inside did Johanna allow herself to breathe again. She stayed with them until dawn, ensuring they were settled and safe before slipping back to her own apartment, alone once more. It was a close call, one of many in the years to come. But Johanna did not stop. As the war dragged on, the situation grew even more dangerous. The Gestapo increased their raids, and informants were everywhere. People disappeared overnight, and suspicion fell on anyone who showed the slightest sign of dissent. Yet, Johanna's resolve only hardened. She continued to open her door to those in need, risking everything to save lives. In the spring of 1943, Johanna's courage was put to the ultimate test. A young Jewish boy, barely 14, arrived at her apartment one afternoon, bruised and bloodied. His name was Benjamin, and he had witnessed the murder of his entire family. He had managed to flee, but the trauma of what he had seen left him mute and trembling, his eyes hollow with shock. Johanna took him in, her heart aching at the sight of his pain. She bathed his wounds, sat with him for hours, and tried to coax him to eat. But Benjamin remained silent, staring blankly at the wall. Days turned into weeks, and still, the boy did not speak. Johanna feared for him. The war was escalating, and resources were dwindling. Each day brought new threats, new challenges, but she would not give up on him. One evening, as she sat beside him, she began to hum softly, a lullaby she had sung to her own children long ago. Slowly, the boy's gaze shifted, his eyes focusing on her for the first time. A tear slipped down his cheek and then another. Johanna reached out, gently taking his hand. "It's all right, child," she whispered. "You're safe here." And for the first time, Benjamin spoke. "Will it ever be over?" he asked, his voice a broken whisper. Johanna's own eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "Yes," she said softly. "One day, it will be over." The war ended in 1945, and with it, the nightmare that had gripped Europe for so many years. Berlin lay in ruins, its people broken and scarred. But amidst the devastation, there were glimmers of hope, small acts of courage that had helped preserve humanity in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Johanna Eck was one of those glimmers. She had sheltered over a dozen people during the war, offering them not just a place to hide, but a reason to hope. When the Allied forces finally liberated Berlin, Johanna's small apartment was empty. Ruth, Benjamin, Max, and the others had all moved on, rebuilding their lives in the shattered remnants of what was once a great city. But they never forgot the quiet woman who had saved them. Years later, Ruth, now an elderly woman herself, returned to Berlin. She stood outside the building where Johanna had risked everything for her, tears streaming down her face. "She saved my life," Ruth said softly, speaking to no one in particular. She gave me hope when I had none left. Johanna Eck passed away in 1979, her story largely unknown outside of the small circle of those she had saved. But in 1980, she was posthumously honored as one of the righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. The honor was a recognition given only to those non-Jews who had risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. But for Johanna, it was never about recognition or praise. Throughout her life, she had shunned the spotlight, choosing instead to act quietly, without expectation of gratitude or reward. In the years after the war, Johanna had returned to her quiet life in Berlin. She never spoke much about what she had done, and even among her closest friends, few knew the extent of her involvement. To them, she was simply Frau Eck, the kind widow who always had a smile and a warm cup of tea to offer. But there were those, like Ruth and Benjamin, who knew that without her, they would not have survived. Ruth went on to build a family in the United States, naming her first daughter Johanna in honor of the woman who had saved her. Benjamin, still struggling with the trauma of his childhood, found solace in a small town in northern Germany, where he became a teacher, dedicating his life to ensuring that future generations would remember the horrors of the past and the quiet bravery of people like Johanna. One of the most poignant stories of Johanna's legacy came decades later, in the early 1970s, when a young historian working on a project to document the stories of Holocaust survivors received a letter from an elderly woman in New York. It was Ruth, who had heard about the historian's work and wanted to share her story. Her account was detailed and vivid, describing not just the fear and despair of those years, but also the kindness and strength of one woman who had made all the difference. The historian, moved by Ruth's words, decided to travel to Berlin to see if there were any traces left of Johanna Eck's life. What he found was a city still haunted by its past. The building where Johanna had lived was still standing, though the neighborhood had changed considerably. The historian spent days knocking on doors, speaking to the older residents who remembered the war. Most shook their heads, saying they did not recall anyone named Johanna Eck. But then, one elderly neighbor, a woman in her late 80s, paused and nodded slowly. "Yes," she said thoughtfully. "Frau Eck, the seamstress. I remember her." She looked out over the street as if seeing through time. She was a quiet one, always kept to herself, but there were rumors. They said she had helped some people. Jews, you know. But back then, you didn't ask too many questions. With this small thread, the historian began piecing together the fragments of Johanna's story. He found a few more survivors, Sarah's children, now adults living in Israel, who remembered a stern but gentle woman who had sung them lullabies at night. Max's grandson, who had grown up hearing about the brave lady who had hidden his grandfather when no one else would. Each story added a new layer to the portrait of Johanna Eck, revealing a woman whose courage and compassion had touched many lives, even though she had acted entirely alone. In 1944, Johanna had taken in an entire family of 4, Jews from the Netherlands who had been on the run for months. They had been betrayed by a supposed friend and had narrowly escaped a raid by the Gestapo. Exhausted and broken, they found their way to Johanna through a network of other hidden families. The parents, Willem and Eva, were hesitant to trust anyone again after what they had endured, but when Johanna opened the door, her expression was one of such genuine concern that they knew in that instant that they were safe. For nearly a year, Johanna hid them in her tiny apartment, even though it meant extreme danger. One day, during a routine check by a neighbor who was known to be a Nazi sympathizer, she was nearly caught. The neighbor, suspicious of the increased noise and movement, confronted her. Johanna, her heart pounding, stood in the doorway, her face calm. "Is something wrong, Herr Müller?" she asked, her voice steady. "I've heard sounds coming from your apartment late at night," he said, narrowing his eyes. "I don't suppose you have something or someone to hide?" Johanna's gaze did not waver. "You must be mistaken," she replied coolly. "Perhaps you're hearing the radio. I sometimes listen to music to pass the time." She smiled, a small, polite smile that gave away nothing. For a long moment, Müller stared at her, as if trying to read her soul. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Very well," he said. "But remember, Frau Eck, "It is dangerous to keep secrets in these times." "Of course," Johanna murmured. "I have nothing to hide." But as soon as he turned away, her knees nearly gave out. She stood in the doorway, trembling, until she was sure he was gone. Only then did she slip back inside, her face pale and drawn. Willem, who had been watching from the shadows, stepped forward, his eyes wide with gratitude and disbelief. "Why do you do this?" he whispered. "You could be killed." Johanna looked at him, her expression softening. "Because someone has to," she said quietly. "Someone has to." The family survived the war, thanks to Johanna's bravery. They eventually made their way to America, where they built new lives. In the 1960s, they reached out to her, sending letters and small gifts, but Johanna, ever modest, thanked them politely and declined any offers of financial support. "I did only what any human being should have done," she wrote in response to Willem's offer to pay for her trip to visit them in New York. "I cannot accept your money, but your gratitude is enough." In the end, Johanna Eck passed away quietly, her deeds known to only a few. But those she saved remembered her not just as a rescuer, but as a symbol of resilience and faith in the darkest of times. Ruth's children and grandchildren, Max's extended family, Benjamin's students, all of them carried a piece of Johanna's legacy with them, spreading her story wherever they went. She became a quiet legend, the elderly seamstress who had defied an empire, not with guns or politics, but with the simple, profound strength of her humanity. Today, Johanna Eck's name is inscribed on the Wall of Honor at Yad Vashem, alongside other righteous among the nations. Visitors pass by, pausing to read her name, to wonder about the woman who had risked so much for strangers. Some know her story. Many do not. But her spirit lives on in the memories of those she saved and in the countless lives that were made possible because of her courage. In a world where hatred and cruelty had reigned supreme, Johanna Eck was a quiet, unassuming hero. She had no medals, no titles, no great speeches to her name. She was just a woman who believed, fiercely and unconditionally, that even one person could make a difference. And in the end, she did. After the war, Berlin was a city marked by the scars of conflict and division. Buildings lay in ruins, and the people wandered through the rubble like ghosts, grappling with the weight of loss and the uncertainty of the future. The lives that had been torn apart, Jewish families shattered, resistance fighters silenced, ordinary people caught in the crossfire of history, seemed impossible to mend. Yet amidst this devastation, there were stories of light that refused to be extinguished, stories of individuals whose quiet acts of defiance made ripples far beyond what they could have ever imagined. One such story was that of Johanna Eck. In the post-war years, Johanna did not seek recognition or reward. She had lived through the rise and fall of a monstrous regime, watched friends and neighbors disappear, and had herself been stalked by the ever-present shadow of the Gestapo. Even after the war, the streets of Berlin were haunted by old ghosts, those who had died and those who had survived but carried the memories of horrors that could never be fully exorcised. Johanna was one of these survivors, but instead of succumbing to bitterness or fear, she chose to continue living by the same principles that had guided her through those dark years: compassion, integrity, and an unyielding belief in the value of human life. With the war over, Berlin was divided into sectors controlled by the Allied powers. The American, British, French, and Soviet authorities each established their own zones of control, and tensions between the occupying forces quickly turned the city into a new kind of battleground. The Cold War was beginning, and Berlin, with its political divisions and lingering wartime wounds, became the epicenter of the growing ideological conflict between East and West. It was a place where new fears were emerging, where spies and informants seemed to lurk in every corner, and where trust, once shattered by war, was now an even rarer commodity. For Johanna, life continued much as it always had. She returned to her work as a seamstress, repairing clothes for neighbors and old friends. But there were still those who remembered what she had done during the war, who knew that behind her unassuming exterior lay a woman of remarkable courage and strength. One day, in the early summer of 1947, a young man appeared at her door. He was tall and thin, his clothes shabby and worn, his face lined with exhaustion. Johanna, peering through the crack in the door, almost didn't recognize him at first. But then he spoke. "Frau Eck?" His voice was soft, hesitant. Johanna's breath caught. Benjamin. The boy she had sheltered so many years ago, mute, broken, his spirit crushed by the horrors he had witnessed, stood before her now as a young man. He had survived. Tears welled up in Johanna's eyes as she stepped forward, pulling him into a tight embrace. He held her awkwardly at first, but then, as if realizing this was real, he relaxed into her arms, his body shaking with quiet sobs. They stood like that for a long moment, two figures bound by shared memories of fear and courage, of loss and survival. "I wanted to find you," Benjamin said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "To thank you and for everything. I'm sorry it took so long." Johanna shook her head, smiling gently as she pulled back to look at him. "There's no need for thanks, child. I'm just glad you're here. You survived. That's all I ever wanted." Benjamin's eyes, once so hollow and empty, were bright now, filled with life. He told her about his journey, how after the war he had been sent to a displaced persons camp, how he had struggled to find his place in a world that seemed to have moved on without him. Eventually, he had been taken in by a distant relative in northern Germany, a kindly man who had helped him finish his education. Now, Benjamin was planning to study medicine, hoping to become a doctor and help others as Johanna had helped him. "You saved me," he said quietly, his gaze steady. "I want to do the same for others. I want to give back." Johanna's heart swelled with pride as she listened to him speak. Here was a young man who had every reason to be consumed by anger and despair, and yet he had chosen a path of healing. She had no children of her own, but in that moment, she felt as if she were looking at a son who would carry her legacy forward into a future that, for the first time in a long time, seemed to hold some measure of hope. As the years passed, Johanna's health began to decline. The war, the years of fear and deprivation, had taken their toll on her frail body. She moved more slowly now, her back stooped, her steps unsteady. But her mind remained sharp, and she continued to work quietly, mending clothes for neighbors and occasionally offering counsel to those still struggling to rebuild their lives. Every so often, a letter would arrive, usually from Ruth, sometimes from Max, or one of the other survivors she had helped. They wrote to her of their new lives, their families, their triumphs and sorrows. And Johanna, sitting in her small, tidy apartment, would read each letter carefully, a soft smile on her lips. Ruth's letters were always filled with news of her growing family. She had married a kind man named David, himself a survivor of the camps, and together they had built a new life in New York. Their children, Johanna learned, were thriving, studious and bright, full of the energy and promise that had once seemed so impossibly far away. In every letter, Ruth thanked Johanna again and again, telling her how much she meant to them, how they owed their very existence to her bravery. But Johanna, ever modest, would simply shake her head and smile. It was never about being brave, she would murmur to herself, folding each letter carefully and placing it in the small wooden box where she kept her most cherished possessions. It was about doing what was right. One winter evening, in the early 1970s, Johanna received an unexpected visitor. It was a young woman, barely in her 20s, with dark hair and eyes that seemed both old and full of life. She introduced herself as Ruth's granddaughter, Johanna, named, of course, after the woman who had saved her grandmother so many years ago. "Grandmother always talked about you," young Johanna said, her voice soft with reverence as she sat beside the elderly woman, holding her hand. "I grew up hearing your story. I just wanted to see you, to meet the person who made my family's life possible." The old Johanna chuckled softly, her eyes bright with affection. "Oh, my dear," she murmured, patting the young woman's hand gently. "I am no hero. I'm just an old seamstress who did what she could." But the young Johanna shook her head firmly. "No," she said quietly. "You're so much more than that." They spent the evening together, talking and laughing, sharing memories and stories. Young Johanna listened intently as the elderly woman spoke, her voice still strong despite the years. They talked about Ruth, about the war, about the years of hiding and fear. But they also talked about hope, about the resilience of the human spirit, about the power of small acts of kindness to change the course of a life. When the evening came to an end and young Johanna rose to leave, she hugged the elderly woman tightly, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." And for the first time, Johanna allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had done, the lives she had saved, the generations that had been made possible because of her choices. It was a bittersweet realization, filled with both pride and sorrow, but as she watched young Johanna walk away into the night, she felt a deep sense of peace. Her story would not be forgotten. Her legacy would live on, carried forward by those she had saved, by the families they had built, by the children and grandchildren who would grow up knowing that in the darkest of times, there were still people who chose to be light. In 1979, at the age of 92, Johanna Eck passed away quietly in her sleep. Her death was not marked by fanfare or ceremony, just a small, simple funeral attended by a handful of neighbors and a few close friends. But halfway around the world, in Israel, in the memorial garden at Yad Vashem, her name was spoken aloud. It was inscribed on the Wall of Honor, alongside other righteous among the nations, a permanent testament to her courage and compassion. In the years that followed, her story spread slowly, quietly, like ripples in a still pond. Ruth's children and grandchildren continued to speak of her, telling her story to new generations. And every so often, a visitor to Yad Vashem would pause before her name, wondering about the woman behind the words, imagining what it must have taken to defy a regime of terror with nothing but her faith and her resolve. Because in the end, Johanna Eck was not just a rescuer. She was a symbol of the quiet, unyielding strength that lies within each of us. The strength to stand up, to reach out, to make a difference, no matter the cost.